Hi, everyone. Welcome to our conversation. I'm Sarah Byrd, and I just want to say first, a huge thanks to everyone behind the New York Textile Month for creating this space to share this story, and also for placing textiles at the center of our attention for a month. So I'm going to start off our story with a little bit of background and big picture ideas to help set the stage for Mae and Carol to take us through this amazing multi-generation project. Please feel free to add any questions that you may have throughout the conversation into the Q&A space at the bottom of the screen. Anytime throughout the talk, I'm going to try and gather those together for us to have a discussion at the end. So Mae, if you want to skip to the next slide. So I come into this story as a lover and a caretaker of clothing and textiles. I think there's magic in the way that fibers become threads, endlessly connecting and transforming through their life cycle. Mae's rag rugs first caught my attention, and even before we met, I found we shared overlapping ideas. When we finally connected, those threads became skirts and opened to an expanse of potential. And I also forgot to mention, we're being recorded, just in case that means anything to anyone. All right, so now we can jump ahead to the next slide.
Just a second.
Mhm.
There we go.
Thank you. So in our early conversations, Mae and I kind of had a lot of conversations that meandered back and forth. And throughout, there was this familiar sense of ambiguity. What are these skirts for? Why do they exist like this? What do we do with them? This uncertainty is common in everyday objects like clothing, especially when it comes to their value and meaning. They live in between. They are the intermediaries. The project calls the skirts a collection, but I see them as part of an archive. Does this distinction matter? Yes and no. No, because words evolve like fashion and are open to interpretation. Yes, because words shape how we treat things. So on the screen here, you can see I've kind of put together two Google definitions and word origins for collection and archive. So looking into those details, a collection in its origin implies that items are gathered, as with these skirts, which Mae and Carol are going to give you all of the details for. An archive in this translation and origin holds public records and originates in the Greek word for government, but that word could also be interpreted as a source of action, suggesting something deeper, a beginning or a foundation. Next. Here, I offer blue highlighted phrases that are the key concepts in my understanding of an archive. Going back to the skirts, our conversations continued and we started to share readings that explored more big ideas, like the power of objects, recognizing when we understand the artifact is in some sense its maker, as Barbara Berman asserts. How things change from stuff to a collection, especially when it moves storage locations, as Christy Robertson explores. And Stuart Hall's suggestion that an archive may begin, quote, when a relatively random collection of works is at the point of becoming something more ordered and considered, an object of reflection and debate, end quote. Next. The ideas and the details you'll hear about from Mae and Carol further push me to think of this less as a collection and more as an archive. Consider, for example, the Italian fashion brand Max Mara's corporate archive and library, established formally in 2003, which places research and inspiration in dialogue with its history, as they refer to it, these two kind of souls. So in this slide, we have an example of a beginning on the far left side with the founder's mother's documents related to sewing and cutting. She kind of was an expert in this and they are saved, and this is the beginnings of all of this story. And then our two other additional images here of the coats and the color kind of vivid colors there are a prompt for a source of action. These garments and color swatches are used for reference in support of new designs. Next. So if we go back to the question of does it matter? I'll briefly offer a case study that helps me think about why it matters, but also presents challenges to the structure of the words in practice. So in 2001, the Metropolitan Museum of Art hosted Jacqueline Kennedy, the White House Years, an exhibition that showcased nearly 100 items from her wardrobe on loan from the JFK Library and Museum. This is showing you two installation images with the entrance and also a selection of her suits and daytime ensembles. As you can see, there's both this contrast of black and white and very colorful images. So these items weren't part of an archive. They're obviously being displayed in a museum and are on loan from a museum. And objects in those types of collections are shaped by curatorial decisions and also public interpretation. Archives, in contrast, preserve, not interpret. However, what's key is the deliberate consideration involved in saving these items. Following a directive of the Kennedy administration, items of both personal and official use were to be saved in order to capture a rich understanding of a presidential era. Jacqueline Kennedy didn't just preserve garments, she made careful choices about what should be saved for future generations. Using Hall's framework of archive origins, two decisions are worth noting. First, Jacqueline Kennedy was selective about which garments to keep, choosing items that reflected both her personal identity and her public role as First Lady. Second, she decided to donate them to the kind of holdings of this library while it was in development. And this donation process occurred over decades, sometimes during her life and sometimes afterwards by the estate. So this suggests perhaps ongoing contemplation and maybe even debate about their use and value. Next. Yet one item took a different, far more memorable path, her pink suit, forever connected to a pivotal moment in American history. Worn multiple times in her role as First Lady, the pink suit became a tangible connection to a tragic event in U.S. history. The memory of it is seared into the collective for those who lived through the assassination, and for the generations after whose primary documentation exists in photographs. Next. Jackie's awareness of the stained suit's power was immediate, and she wore it throughout the very public events that followed, including the transportation of the president's casket from Texas, as seen in this image here, and also for the swearing in of Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson. So, what was just another suit in her wardrobe suddenly was transformed into this tangible marker of memory. And thus, the garment's life shifted into another space almost immediately. The suit was delivered to the National Archives a few months later, sometime in early 1964, where it remains in a space to this day designed for ideal preservation. Next. This brings me to Jacques Derrida's concept of the archive, which challenges us to rethink whether these skirts are simply a collection or something more. Although this object of Jacqueline Kennedy exists in an archive since 1964, formal ownership wasn't transferred until 2003. So during this period, the suit was in limbo, protected but not fully accessible, like those other items in the JFK library. Archives have an obligation to preserve items that are deemed important, but they also impose restrictions. So when the deed of gift was completed, it included a clause preventing access for 100 years. In doing so, the suit becomes less a relic of the past and more, as Stuart Hall might suggest, quote, an object of reflection and debate, end quote. Next. And as fashion historians will remind us, the suit isn't Chanel, as is stated on the deed, but a licensed copy made by Chez Ninon, a reminder that objects are often more complex than they seem. Unlike Jackie's suit, which is preserved and sealed off from public view, the wool skirts we're about to see represent an archive in progress. Their story is still unfolding, and it won't be complete until their life cycle is finished. I'll let Mae and Carol tell you the rest of that story.
Thank you, Sarah, for introducing all of these big ideas and very big questions, and also for offering this example of Jacqueline Kennedy's suit as a point of comparison and connection. Some of the skirts in our collection do resemble the skirt that Jacqueline Kennedy was wearing on that day. They're also wool, they are also pastel, and they also bear traces of their past use. This example that you see here is a 1960s era spring weight wool skirt in pastel colors that appears to be splattered by mud. The difference is that the skirts in our collection belong to unknown people and are marked by unknown events. They are secondhand, purchased by my grandma at thrift stores in and around St. Paul, Minnesota between the 1960s and the 1990s. Another difference is that the skirts in our collection have been housed in much more casual conditions than the National Archives. A basement, a garage, my weaving studio, and there is no deed of gift. In fact, my grandma seldom spoke about the collection as such, aware perhaps that it might be considered excessive for an individual to own so many skirts. So it's really only in the time since her death in 2022 that we've started to piece together the narrative that we're going to share today. And this next part of the presentation will be shared between myself and my mom. And our goal is to introduce the history of the collection, our cataloging process, discoveries we made along the way, and then possible visions for the collection's future. So we start with this slide, which features 3 white women of different ages smiling in front of a hedge. The youngest is holding a baby. From the hair, the clothing, and especially the glasses, we can tell it's the late 1980s. From left to right, these are my great-grandma, my mom, and my grandma Audrey, who collected the skirts. We open with this photo because it illustrates the intergenerational aspect of this project. My great-grandma was not directly involved in the collection, but she modeled a life of making, craft, and thrift. My grandma collected the skirts. My mom used them, and in her own career as a costume designer and clothing historian, has become deeply knowledgeable about wool, textiles, and clothing. I grew up to become a weaver and textile researcher with an education in art and design history and curatorial studies. This photo also illustrates the life cycles that inform this collection: birth, death, and material goods that persist across generations, matter that outlives an individual and that is eventually cleared out of a basement, a garage, a house, something many of us can relate to. So, Mom, tell us about this photo and what it illustrates about the origins of this collection.
Right. First, I just want to say how happy I am to be able to uh, tell this story today. It happens to be what would have been my mother's 102nd birthday. She was born on September 27th in 1922. So she's not with us today, but she was with us until just 2 years ago. She was almost 100 when she died. So she had a lot of time, and we had time with her, so she could pass on her knowledge and interest of textiles. So this brief run through of a little bit of the history of the collection addresses Sarah's question earlier: why do they exist like this? I found this photo in my mother's family album. It's her street where she grew up in South Minneapolis in the 1930s. She described it to me as a day the rag man came to her street to collect household rags brought to the curb by families, and as the truck went by, they would be picked up. It reflects a time when textile items were far less plentiful than they are today, and there were local industrial systems, so all the rags would be reused. Cottons as paper, wools were resold or shredded and rewoven into very useful recycled wool or shoddy. This was the time of the Great Depression. It was an era which defined my mother's idea of thrift and began her habit of reusing textiles. Next slide. So textiles from the home could be given to the ragman, or very often they were reused right within the home in each household. This photo of a rug saved in a museum collection is reminiscent of rugs that were familiar to all of the generations of my family here in the Midwest. Here, wool and cotton rags were used to make this example. And it illustrates a creative reuse of fabrics within a home setting. A similar story, of course, can be told of scrap quilts. Many were made of wool as well as cottons, and they were also very common to my mother's generation and beyond. Next slide. Okay, this is another photo from our family albums, and we have it here to illustrate the cold climate where these wool skirts have been used and collected. They are sheep that belong to my sister-in-law, and so they are demonstrating here our varied interest in wool throughout the family, and how wool has been valued for its really life-sustaining qualities of warmth and durability. Next slide. This is my mother's house. When my parents moved to this house in St. Paul, Mom already had many skirts in boxes. But here she had the space for the collection to grow. And as she added skirts, she was able to house them on dedicated shelving that my dad built in the basement. The order that she kept within these skirts was the order that she had purchased them. So that was the only order at that time, but they were well cared for in the house. Next.
So people often ask if she wore them.
Oh, yeah, that's right. She did. Somewhat, not a lot, but both my mother and I often went into the boxes and pulled out a festive skirt at the holidays. And so this is my mother at a family gathering with my son and niece, and Mae as a baby in her arms, wearing this skirt that was that continues on in the collection. And so I use some of these skirts and for wearing throughout the decades that Mom was collecting. And next slide, I also, in my career as a costume designer, you made some into costumes for university productions. In this case, this was Taming of the Shrew, Shakespeare's play. We explored the construction of changing gender roles within Shakespeare's characters in this production. So the pleated skirts provided a visual vocabulary for this, both male and female characters. You can notice also here a mid-1990s grunge reference relating this interpretation of Shakespeare to 90s culture for the audience. Next. All along, the skirts were also used for various craft uses. My mother used some in this way. She'd spend time outdoors ripping the skirts apart, then washing and drying and cutting and reassembling them as blankets or other things, such as this crocheted throw. She loved this format because it really showcased the wide variety of colors, textures, patterns. And she believed that in this way she could share her belief that really the best, highest quality wool was becoming more and more scarce. She initialed this throw with her with her initials Audrey Huset, 1975. So she would have been in her 50s when she did this piece. Next. She usually wanted to preserve her favorite fabrics, but I was interested in cutting them into narrow strips and reweaving them into, in this case, rugs. And eventually she thought that was okay and also encouraged us to do that. This is my drawing and preparation for a rag rug, which I wove as a graduate student. I saw the skirt collection as a resource for seemingly endless varieties of color composition. And this rug is still in use today after about 50 years of use. Next. It was a family thing. My husband also designed and wove wool rugs during the 70s and 80s. This is a rug that is in our back hallway, and his preliminary sketches for a series of rugs. They were related to a favorite highway through the forest in northern Minnesota with the typical yellow line for a lane division and the green at the edges of the road. So a lot got used in this way. My sister-in-law, Kathy, also wove many inspired wool rugs, and you'll meet her as the story continues. Next.
Okay, so this has given you a general sense of the motivations that inform the creation of this collection and how the skirts have been put to use over the many decades of my grandma's lifetime. It's important to note here that while some of the skirts were indeed used, most remained in boxes for decades, untouched until my grandma moved from her house, which you saw, into an apartment towards the end of her life. So this is where I've marked the first step in the cataloging process. And this was undertaken by my mom and my aunt. These are photos from 2013, and Mom, I'll let you describe what's going on here.
Right. Mom was moving, so Kathy and I are here, shown in her basement, sorting the wool skirts. We made two decisions. One, we would save the skirts. And two, we would sort them by color because we intended to use them to weave. We transferred them into smaller boxes, easier to move around, and we arranged the boxes according to the spectrum, and then moved them north to my garage in Duluth, Minnesota. And this seemed like a good idea, in part because in winter here, the temperature dependably gets colder than 20 below zero. So we didn't have to worry too much about insect infestation. They always got frozen every winter.
So this is where the skirts remained for about a decade until my grandma's death in 2022. And by this point, I was in my mid-30s and I had started to weave rag rugs, thinking about the idea that my mom and aunt had shared of working together to weave all the skirts into rag rugs. And so I began to wonder what this project would actually entail. And so, in my grandma's honor, I wove this 1 square foot sample using material from the wool skirts to calculate the actual scale of this project. And I was able to estimate or extrapolate in weaving this that the collection could yield around 1,000 square feet of rag rugs, and that the cutting and weaving alone would take around 2,000 hours, which is about 1 year of full-time work. This sample was part of an exhibition at the Cornell University Library that was co-curated by Marcy Suzanne Farwell, a textile curator and archivist. And it was in conversation with her that I began to think twice about this idea of cutting up all the skirts and weaving them into rag rugs. She said something that really struck me. She said, it's hard to imagine cutting up all of those skirts. And her point was that these skirts in this collection that span the second half of the 20th century can never be recreated. The quality of the wool, the variety of fabrics, the construction of the skirts, due in part to climate change, in part to the shift from natural to synthetic petroleum-based fibers, and in part to changes in manufacturing, and also simply in shifts to the way that people dress. The point is that this collection may have historical value in addition to its value as usable material. So, last summer, while visiting my parents, we decided to test this. We took out 2 of the 51 boxes to see what was inside, and we laid them out on the driveway. And we were in fact quite surprised. We found skirts of so many different styles, so many different patterns, very high quality wool. We came across Pendleton labels and Ladies Garment Workers Union labels and labels from Minnesota producers that no longer exist. And we decided that before we do anything else with the collection, we would make the effort to document it. So, in April of this year, we carved out 2 weeks to do so, and it was a very collaborative process. Here, my mom and aunt are taking the skirts out of the boxes for the first time in 10 years to air them out on the clothesline. During these 2 weeks, my aunt and uncle visited, my dad cooked, and as a photographer, helped us photograph each skirt. And my mom and I worked very long hours to identify and document what we found in each box. Every day, we aired out a new batch of skirts, rain or shine, for all of the neighbors to see. We then took the skirts inside to label each one with the box number and the skirt number. And this is how we came up with the final count of 632 wool skirts. We then recorded ourselves describing each skirt. And this was both to document our impressions as we handled each one and to develop descriptive vocabulary that can, in digital format, later be used to sort the collection and make it searchable. This was a list that we kept in front of us as we described each skirt. So we were thinking about color, shape, closures, labels, measurements, of course, and then we also made an effort to date or give an approximate date for each skirt. My mom then steamed the front of every skirt to remove the distraction of wrinkles as we photographed them, here with proper lighting and tripod against a neutral background, all of which my dad set up in his photo studio. This is a rare pair of pants in the collection. We then folded the skirts back up and put them back in their boxes, and then in a rented minivan, drove them across the country to my studio in Brooklyn. So I'm pictured here on the left with the new wall of boxes in my studio, and on the right with an open box, there's an open box with a stack of skirts on the table ready to be viewed. And so this is also an invitation for you all to make an appointment with me, send me an email, and come and visit my studio and see the wool skirts. As you can imagine, this was a huge recontextualization of the collection, from a garage in Duluth to a studio in Brooklyn, and of course, a huge shift in our perspective. So I'll ask Mom to share some of these new insights and discoveries.
Right. During this cataloging process, we were starting with 600 skirts in their order of color. But style is another way of sorting. So next slide. Here we're looking at a selection of the many skirts in the collection in the style category of pleated skirts. Our description over such a variety of skirts was always lively, and it became more animated as we realized the extent to which 20th century skirts related a story of changing women's lives. I recalled that in the 60s and prior to that, it was required that girls wear skirts in school, and women were expected to wear skirts in most public settings. There was a gender-based dress code, which was enforced through social expectations. if not stated rules. This changed, but not quickly, actually. It took decades. What can we see in this collection that point to those incremental changes? The question led to, yes, a need to assign approximate dates to each skirt. But there were a couple of caveats in doing that I would just want to mention here. Dating any individual skirt in isolation isn't easy because people do keep clothing beyond the cycle of fashion defined by the fashion industry. And also, this slide of pleated skirts provides another difficulty in assigning dates. Pleated skirts have been considered classic, and for that reason, they're very versatile. But think of girls' school uniforms, for instance, pretty much unchanging from the 50s to the 90s and beyond that. And also, in this collection, we have named tartans made into kilts from various of the British Isles that are considered traditional because they're relatively unchanging. So these are hard to classify by date. And yet, next slide, the skirts that are not pleated are more easily put into a style sequence, roughly decade by decade. And so by identifying features of overall silhouette and other style details, we found 6 decades represented, which I'll briefly summarize here. This slide shows some examples of the 1940s and an image also from the 40s. In the 40s, a straight silhouette possibly reflected wartime scarcity of fabric, and kick pleats in the back allowed for movement. But really, in this collection, only a few 1940s skirts show up. I think the ragman had probably collected them during those wartime shortages. But let's go on to the 50s, where the silhouette is still very slim. They were longer, though, with a very narrow pencil-thin silhouette and a cinched waist. Basically, a lot of very small waist measurements. We know that 50s fashion also did offer the new look with expansive skirts and still the narrow waist, but the collection has none of these. And again, I'm speculating that that much wool yardage probably was reused in its own time. So we have few from the 50s. The collection starts to expand in the 60s. We had seen the Jackie Kennedy wool suit from 1963. By a little later in that decade, the A-line skirt, mini skirt, was embraced, at least by the young. So these skirts might reflect those turbulent times of social upheaval and the simultaneous changing roles of women experienced during that decade. This micro A-line skirt was usually worn with colorful hose, which I associate with the space age futuristic aesthetic, really, as the world during this decade was watching the lead up to the moonwalk. Moving into the 70s, the collection includes mid-calf or midi hemlines of longer skirts of that era. Also, this decade's more fluid skirts feature cut, allowing tweed woolen fabrics to be in motion around the body, amplified by bias, gauze, fringe, and accompanied by tie belts and more fringe accessories. Next, we move into the 80s. Suits, seen here, had exaggerated features from menswear, including the shoulder pads, you remember from the 80s, and also a stiff, blocky silhouette, both the jackets and the skirts. The 1980s women's version of the business suit seemed to take on qualities of a protective uniform. Did women need this uniform to help establish authority in the workplace? It seemed like it. Skirts and pants featured vertical tucks on either side of a front panel, and almost all of them had very useful menswear style slash pockets. The 80s skirts are very well represented in the collection. And so I haven't quite speculated yet as to why that is. Cycle of my mother's collection, or people wanted to move on from this style and move into something else. In the 90s, next slide, we see the silhouette slimming, and it's really skimming the body shape again, but this time with downward sloping side seams. So the skirt is wider at the hips than at the hem. It's like the reverse of an A-line. And to compensate for this and allow movement, slits, not kick pleats, appeared at the back, the side, the center front, or off center around the skirt, revealing the legs and enhancing a woman's stride. This trend, I think, may have been tied to the 90s fitness craze. And the 90s skirts are not too prevalent in the collection, of course, indicating a switch to allowing pants into the workplace and in more settings. But also, this is the decade when synthetic clothing increased and mom was finding fewer 100% wool skirts available. And so her collecting process started to slow during this time. So next slide, in this cavalcade of styles, we do see evidence of changing women's lives. And other ways to sort the skirts besides by style could be giving us stories based on the origin of the fabrics themselves from the labels, or the location of manufacture, or the qualities implied by the label, or sizing, standard or custom sizing, for instance. I am personally intrigued by all aspects of the making of these skirts. I always wonder who did the sewing, whether it was sewing at home or sewing in local or regional companies, or in our major garment centers in New York City or LA, or beginning offshore construction of many of these skirts as we saw labels from Asia or Europe. This black skirt starts to tell another story where we can start to get more personal in our storytelling rather than these broad stories based on these big categories. When you focus in on each particular skirt, many of them will tell some backstory of the individual who wore them. This black skirt, it's a little hard to read what's going on with it, but by the label, it was purchased ready-made. But later, it was altered with a hasty insertion of a elastic maternity panel. So home sewing saved the day for someone. Maybe the skirt belonged to a mother-to-be with a pressing need to continue to work, or for another occasion, perhaps a funeral, which was still the norm to wear dark colors for funerals during this era. So here the plot can thicken a little bit because a whole subset of these skirts carry hints of the owner's backstory. And if a skirt was altered over time, the wool retains that memory. Or if a skirt was made at home or professionally commissioned by a dressmaker or a tailor, it reflected personal taste. And so on close inspection, all of those details start to reveal stories. So I will now transfer a little bit to our next topic. Mae is going to talk about what about the future. I'll say, though, we discovered different stories when we were standing back to take a long view of these groups of skirts, or if we started on focusing on individual skirts, those stories, as I mentioned. Each skirt once belonged to an individual, and then it was given to a thrift store in hopes of another owner who would continue the story. My mom gathered them up and added her own chapter to this story. And now time has passed, time which has allowed for new perspectives, such as our hope for a more sustainable use of textiles in our marketplace and in our wardrobes. So the question for the collection as it arrives in Brooklyn is, it's got a new generation looking at it. What happens next?
What?
Okay.
All right. Hmm?
I'm very curious.
Yes, I'm curious too. Thank you for piecing together all of this knowledge and information about providing at least one way in to what the collection can tell us when seen from multiple perspectives. So you can all tell by this point that there's a lot here. There are a lot of skirts, there's a lot of documentation, and there are also many possibilities. So the first thing I did when I got back to Brooklyn and got myself settled was to make a tropy that's spelled Tropy. And this was suggested by my friend Maeve Hogan. And Tropy is a free open source software that allowed me to collect all of the photos and then begin to describe and tag each one. So in this image, you can see on the left all of the tags that I've created so far as they relate to some of the categories that you heard my mom describe: decade, label, silhouette, whether the skirts were handmade, altered, or deconstructed. This is proven to be a very helpful kind of back end as we pave the way to searching and sorting the collection. And the tropy also provided a very helpful visual template for the website that I made next. And I used a website builder called Cargo, and this offered a fairly efficient way for me to make the photos accessible in public, and thereby also begin inviting collaboration and participation. Currently on the website, as you can see, the skirts are in the exact order in which my mom and I labeled them, box by box. And this is, of course, based on the color categories that my mom and aunt established 10 years ago. Both the tropy and the website are very much works in progress. I've only just started to transcribe our recorded descriptions of each skirt, but they've allowed us to visualize the collection's scale and observe its formal qualities in ways we never could have before. I also added an essay to the website, which allowed me to collect my thoughts about the project so far. All right, so I'm not going to go through the whole website, but you can do that on your own time. I was talking about the collaborative annotated bibliography that we've started to make together. And of course, I invite you to go to the website and take a look and also contribute your own sources if sources come to mind. We've loosely organized this bibliography into 4 categories. Those are fibers and fabrics, clothing and fashion, collections and archives, and then art and narrative. And those are categories that we've seen as relevant to this collection thus far. They will continue to evolve. This last category, art and narrative, is very loosely defined, but it's been a place for me to try to assemble examples of how other people have thought through large collections like this one in book and exhibition formats. So books, like our website, can accommodate quantity in a very efficient way, and they can also provide a uniquely ordered, sequential experience of this quantity. So I'll show a few examples here of books that you'll also find in the bibliography. This is a book that documents a collection of 500 sweaters knit by Louis Veenstra, who was a knitter in the Netherlands since 1955. And here you can see these sweaters are laid out one per page or two per spread, uniform in scale but distinct in their arrangement in a way that creates a sense of movement and also an opportunity to glimpse the backside of a sleeve, for example. This is a book that illustrates the painter Isabella Ducrot's collection of 252 textiles amassed over her lifetime. It's a fairly luxurious book with one textile per spread, with just a whisper of information on the facing page, indicating origin, age, size, material of each textile. And this is a book that documents 251 paper airplanes collected by polymath Harry Smith in New York City between 1961 and 1983. As you can see, there are multiple airplanes per spread. The background shadows, the gradients, are interesting to me, and the choices about which side of each of these multi-sided objects to photograph. Additional notes, including Smith's own comments about the date and about when and where he found each airplane, are listed in the back of the book. So books can be one very magical way to combine images and information about a collection, but they can be somewhat deceptive when it comes to the physical experience of a collection. It's mass. And so this is when I will introduce a couple examples of exhibition and installation formats. I thought to include this example of Joseph Boy's felt suit, which was made as an edition of 100 and is now dispersed across many museum collections. A handful of them are shown together on a rack on the left, but like the title, which is in the singular, felt suit, a single suit is often displayed hanging on a wall, as you see on the right, isolated as a singular object of contemplation. I also include this example by artist Marie Watt. This work is called Dwelling, and it's composed of over 1,000 donated wool blankets stacked flat to become this large cubic mass. Many of the blankets also have tags with the name of the donor and the story of the blanket, which is then legible to the viewer upon closer inspection. And finally, Sarah Berman's Closet, an artwork that is a recreation of artists Alex Coleman and his mother, Myra Coleman's mother's closet in her New York City apartment. Her blouses, her bras, her shoes, her towels. Here, quantity is less impressive than the uniformity of the items and their careful arrangement, like with like, across this open shelving. So in addition to these outside examples, many of which were suggested to me by friends, I've also been keeping a list of input from friends and associates who I've talked to about the project. And this may be their points of reference, suggestions for ways to think about the collection, ideas about what to do with it all, which is something that we will turn to shortly in this presentation. I want to acknowledge especially my friend Sam Bennett, who is in the audience here, who got all of these juices flowing for me last September when she gave me a platform to talk about this project. This is a very meandering list, as you can see, in a very loose order that touches on moving left to right through these columns, possibilities for display, for further documentation, for artistic interventions, for connections and relationships, and for dispersal, returning the skirts back into circulation. Dispersing the collection is what I see as my ultimate role in this project. I've italicized some lines that stand out to me in particular. Number one, you don't have to take it all on yourself. Number two, disperse the collection, document the dispersal of the collection, collect this documentation. And number three, because I simply can't help myself, weave them into rag rugs. I will indeed be weaving some of these skirts into rag rugs. So what could this mean, returning the skirts back into circulation? It could mean many different things. I include here an image of a spread of a book illustrating 12 wool jackets in the Smith College Historic Clothing Collection. And this is a unique collection in that it focuses on everyday garments as opposed to high fashion. And I believe that in our collection, we have a skirt to go with every single one of these jackets. I also include this here because this particular collection is making its museum debut today in an exhibition opening at the New York Historical Society. Returning them back into circulation could also mean wearing the skirts, selling some, giving some to people to be worn. I took this photo earlier this year of a couple walking down 8th Avenue, arm in arm. They're wearing matching wool kilts, wool plaid kilts, paired with, in this case, a windbreaker and an oversized synthetic fleece jacket. Putting them back in circulation could also mean cutting them up and making them into something new, into art, into quilts, into rag rugs. This is an image of a piece made by artist Louise Bourgeois towards the end of her life with the help of a seamstress. This is probably made of cotton, but I include it here because of the way it illustrates how a plaid fabric can be recomposed when it's cut apart and pieced back together, in this case into this beautiful radiating composition. Putting the skirts back into circulation could also mean recycling them or composting them. This is an image from a book, Shoddy, which you'll also find in our bibliography, and I include it here to remind us that wool is indeed biodegradable, that it can return to the earth. That is my final line, and I'm going to hand the microphone. I'm going to invite Sarah to jump in here, and I will, I think, transition into a different slide that will allow us to take some notes as we move through the conversation and Q&A.
Thank you, Mae and Carol. I always enjoy hearing the story behind the skirts. We invite you all to participate in kind of like text discussion, but also indicate your interest in maybe joining us for other events in the future, smaller or more intimate in real life. So if you have anything, feel free to put it in the chat. We have one question and a comment in there already. But also just thank you so much for your time and joining us today to hear this story.
Yes, thank you so much. And we have this document here, and I have actually added 2 questions that came up as I was finishing the presentation for all of you to think about who have joined us today. What is possible now with a collection in one place? And by contrast, what is possible later as the collection is dispersed? And so I'm stating those now. Feel free to think about them as we move through these other questions and conversation. And I look forward to hearing your input. Mom, do you have anything to add at this point?
I think there's a question there that triggers my thoughts. Yes, people have offered skirts to me because they aren't easy to keep. People have limited space, and they really require conditions that you can't always provide in an individual household. So we know this is a finite collection, but we're just not sure its longevity. It's probably, instead of remaining the size it is, as you implied, it's going to be diminishing. And so, yes, we are not adding more skirts to it right now.
Yes, here, we're not adding skirts to the collection now. I'll also say that in talking about this in this public way, we're also hoping to contribute our knowledge about wool and about the care of wool, to have a conversation about that, because in some ways the see, I'm trying to not get distracted. The knowledge about taking care of wool has diminished alongside, and maybe in part because of, wool going out of circulation in place of synthetic materials, which are considered easier to take care of and can be thrown in the washing machine and thrown in the dryer. So we're not taking skirts ourselves, taking on more wool skirts ourselves, but we're happy to have you join the conversation if you are the steward of a wool skirt or a collection of wool skirts, and would like to talk about how you might take care of them in your home. Mom, do you have a handle on how many of the skirts were handmade?
Because we haven't really transcribed all of our discussions that we had over these skirts, a real count is yet to come. But I would say it could be between 5 and 10%, maybe. Do you think? It certainly triggered my home sewing interest because I've sewn a lot. My mother's sewed a lot. She had tailoring skills as well as dressmaking skills, and I just loved being inside some of these skirts as we, mainly took an assessment from the outside.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the percentage of handmade skirts shifted across those decades that you saw. The early skirts, if they weren't handmade, they might have been made in a tailoring shop, or a fairly local production situation. And then over time, we began to see, what is the word? Machine hems and other things that's like reflect the automatization, anyway, like the automation of clothing production. All right, we've got a lot coming in. Sarah, would you like to guide us through these?
Sure. It's probably going to flow through. But I think there's are there emotions that come up when you transform the skirts into another form? And if so, what are they, and how do you manage them, move through, or sit with them?
That might be interesting for you to talk about first, Mom, since you have been doing this for so much longer than I have.
I get, basically just happy transforming them into other things. My one slide where I said I had to kind of convince my mother that I could cut them into little strips. I feel like that led to so much fun and really very useful use of the skirts, and that interest you're following as well, using wool from this source to weave with.
Mm-hmm.
I'd like to do some weaving from this wool even beyond rugs, but that's yet to come.
I would say it's for me less of an emotional process cutting up the skirts and working with them than it is a sensory experience. They do smell, and they certainly remind me of the smell of my grandma's basement. And that brings, of course, many memories. I don't personally feel so precious about any of the skirts. I mean, people ask, well, are you going to keep any? Are you going to wear some? I haven't integrated any into my own wardrobe yet. I'm relieved to have them in boxes in my studio and not have them with me in such an intimate way, personally.
So another question was, have any museums or archives expressed an interest in this collection, either all or in pieces?
We haven't really opened that door yet. And I think in piecing together this presentation, we have defined that as an interest and in something we intend to do. It's now very helpful to have all of this documentation in one place and to be able to show museums and archives what we have. And I think that will open up possibilities that we haven't quite envisioned yet. Anything to add, Mom?
Well, yeah, there are things, certain skirts that just trigger, interest, which might be certain collections. We have a design museum here in Minnesota, might be interested in the Minnesota manufactured skirts. And, information continues to come in. I just was thrilled to learn of the personal story of a woman still alive who worked in one of these small manufacturing companies, through these decades. So there are things that can augment what we already know in terms of oral histories, for instance, was on your list. There's a lot of things that could be added, both by us or by whoever might be interested in contributing.
And I will say that is very much my hope and vision for the collection moving forward, is that it can have these multiple destinies. And maybe a couple skirts end up in the design museum at the University of Minnesota with that story attached. And that's then something that I would hope to compile and document as a book or as a website. Make a very long list that is a poem that includes the names and destinies of all of the wool skirts with an image. You can imagine flipping like a playing card, the back and the front, an image of where it ended up and how it's being used at this point. I mean, it's such an imaginative process to think about where the skirts might walk next.
I wonder if we'll come back to this next question because I want to check in a resource book about it. But there was another question about what it was like to work together and decide how to move forward with this project.
Hmm. Well, I enjoy working with my mom. And it was a real pleasure to spend those 2 weeks at my parents' house with my aunt and uncle, other neighbors, other friends. The local rag rug interest group had an evening show and tell at my parents' house. And so everyone got to tour the collection and give their input then. It's been very dynamic, and I feel really and it also seems very important to, at this point, also my mom has so much knowledge and has had this very rich career. And so to be able to apply all of that knowledge here to this collection that's been in the basement and then in the garage for so many years is pretty exciting. Somehow, the wool collection, it's like something in the water. We all became kind of wool obsessed independently. And then we get to come around to this collection and work together on it. So that's been pretty exciting. Mom?
Yeah, I can't really read all the other questions, but I love the fact that there are comments coming in from people who are part of my past and part of your past and part of even our family in Norway. So it's wonderful to, as I said at the beginning, when I started to tell the history, to be able to share this, and also on this occasion of my mother's birthday. So, and it's been a great dialogue. I hope that some of you choose to do some of the readings in the bibliography and add your ideas to that as well.
Absolutely. I look forward to seeing what other people contribute to that reading list. And um, so May, I was trying to recall, and maybe you know, because you actually put this book on our reading list on Shoddy, and there's a question here about essentially composting textiles and the question of dyes. And we know that even natural dyes do have some things that are not necessarily the healthiest for people or the environment. Do you have any recommendations about how to research this topic or recall if Shoddy talks about that directly? I can't recall.
I can't either, and I wondered if someone would ask that question because I know that I don't have the answer to it. So that's something we can investigate. Maybe Mom has a resource to recommend.
Textile scientists will have a call on that, I think. And I have seen gardening suggestions of, laying clothing in the bottom of a raised bed that will eventually, of course, disappear. But it serves a purpose, supporting the dirt. So people are at least experimenting with it and trying it. But I can't say whether it's the best idea for your own home gardening or not. I think Shadi might have the book I read also might have talked about pollution when it's done on a huge, large scale, like it was there historically in England, and has also been done in Italy and other parts of the world. But here we're talking about natural fibers anyway, not synthetic fibers.
Mhm.
And I think this last question sort of touches on that idea too of kind of how we reuse. So do you have any thoughts about the erasure of domestic materiality, which thus adding to our landfills on a cultural level?
It's an amazing question. Um, Thoughts about the erasure of domestic materiality, thus adding to our landfills on a cultural level. There's a book that I think is in the bibliography, and if it's not, we can add it. It's called Secondhand. It's by Adam Minter, and it really does begin with these stories about clearing out someone's house and what happens to all of that matter from past generations that is generally not wanted or even not particularly useful to future generations. So it might take me a moment to come up with more thoughts about this. I think erasure is a really interesting way to frame that, because it's something that's often so personal and so active. It's like an urgent need to disperse or discard the material that someone has accumulated in their lifetime, and to take on bits and pieces of it. So, my grandma collected many things beyond wool skirts. The wool skirt collection was her largest, but there were many other things that mostly my mom and aunt and others had to find homes for.
And my comment that contemplating this collection now at this turning point for it is also a time when we are all thinking about these ways to make our lives, our personal lives, more sustainable. And that is part and parcel of saving some things, making choices, making personal choices of what is going to be useful, at least for your life and maybe another generation. But and and saving some things instead of getting new, you know. So that's it's going against the the flow of fashion in a way, but it's a lot of personal decisions, just like you know, whether you choose to buy an electric car or not. You know, you're making these personal decisions, and maybe enough of them get made across a spectrum of people, so some difference is made on a larger scale.
Yeah, it's almost about, you know, the viability of the decisions that I make across and for future generations.
Mhm.
You know, it's something that my grandma didn't seem to dwell on too much, what would happen to the wool skirts. She wanted to know that she had them, and she had that assurance through her lifetime, and then she really left it very open um, for us to decide. And for a whole bunch of years, it felt perhaps more like a storage problem than an opportunity, and we have thus been very conscientious about shifting our perspective and taking our time. It's really taken time and care. Time, care, love. Those are three the three ingredients that have I guess enabled us to move through this quite laborious process. And excitement and curiosity. I'm deeply curious about what this possibility is, what this process will yield. So I also, on that note, when we talked about how has it been to work together, I'd also like to acknowledge how wonderful it's been to work with Sarah, who's been an amazing, I would say at first, audience. I mean, when we moved the collection to Brooklyn, suddenly we had this whole new audience of people to talk to about the collection, and then guide in expanding our thinking and helping us to clarify how our knowledge and the sources that we're collecting together can inform the future of this process. Really, I mean, providing, like, if it was decontextualized by moving it from the garage to New York, it's entered this whole rich new context of interesting art, fashion, archive, dialogue in New York City. So I'm excited for that to continue to yield.
Yeah, this process has been fantastic. I love to see collections move out of expected spaces and into kind of new definitions and new potentials for saving and using and reusing stuff. It's really kind of the space we all are in culturally, I think. So I just want to check in on time, Mae, Carol, and our hosts. Do we feel like there's any additional things that we want to address from our questions or audience, or anything that came up?
Oh, let's see. Blending the tartan kilts to traditional Scottish festivals. We'll certainly look into that. Thank you for that suggestion. And I certainly look forward to investigating and thinking about these questions and comments more thoroughly. Thank you. Wow.
Oh, yes. It's wonderful. Right, the idea of seeing these Scottish kilts in motion again on bodies is just fun to read right here, and just knowing that these skirts have all been designed to enhance and extend our human form. It's something you can forget when you're looking at these rather flat images. So
Thanks for saying that, Mom.
Mhm.
It was amazing to move through the decades and to see how skirts could be so restrictive in the 40s and 50s. How could people walk? And then also return to that in the 90s. Interesting. Well,
Easier to walk in a skirt than a pair of pants.
barrier. Yes.
It depends on your perspective and your experience, right? So I think this is a great space for us to conclude this portion of the story. And thank you again to Mae for sharing this with me and Carol for continuing to teach me more. I love being in the proximity of other teachers and historians.
Thank you. Thank you.